My father was silent. Then he said, "All my life, I've had to be heedful of what white folks thought. Well, I'm tired of that. I worked hard for everything I got. Got it honest too. Now I got that Cadillac because I liked it and because it meant something to me that somebody like me from Mississippi could go and buy it. It's my car. I paid for it and I'm driving it south." My mother, who had said nothing through all this, now stood. "Then the girls and I'll be going too," she said. "No," said my father. My mother only looked at him and went off to the kitchen. My father shook his head. It seemed he didn't want us to go. My uncles looked at each other, then at my father. "You set on doing this? We'll all go," they said. "That way we can watch out for each other." My father took a moment and nodded. Then my aunts got up and went off to their kitchen too. All the next day, my aunts and my mother cooked, and the house was filled with delicious smells. They fried chicken and baked hams and cakes and sweet potato pies and mixed potato salad. They filled jugs with water and punch and coffee. Then they packed everything in huge picnic baskets, along with bread and boiled eggs, oranges and apples, plates and napkins, spoons and forks and cups. They placed all that food on the back seats of the cars. It was like a grand picnic we were going on, and Wilma and I were mighty excited. We could hardly wait to start. My father, my mother, Wilma, and I got into the Cadillac. My uncles, my aunts, my cousins got into the Ford, the Buick, and the Chevrolet, and we rolled off in our caravan headed south. Though my mother was finally riding in the Cadillac, she had no praise for it. In fact, she said nothing about it at all. She still seemed upset, and since she still seemed to feel the same about the car, I wondered why she had insisted upon making this trip with my father. We left the city of Toledo behind, drove through Bowling Green and down through the Ohio countryside of farms and small towns, through Dayton and Cincinnati, and across the Ohio River into Kentucky. On the other side of the river, my father stopped the car and looked back at Wilma and me and said, "Now, from here on, whenever we stop and there are white people around, I don't want either one of you to say a word, not one word. Your mother and I'll do all the talking. That understood?" "Yes, sir," Wilma and I both said, though we didn't truly understand why. My father nodded, looked at my mother, and started the car again. We rolled on, down Highway 25 and through the bluegrass hills of Kentucky. Soon we began to see signs that read, "White only, colored not allowed." Hours later, we left the bluegrass state and crossed into Tennessee. Now we saw even more of the signs saying, "White only, colored not allowed." We saw the signs above water fountains and in restaurant windows. We saw them in ice cream parlors and at hamburger stands. We saw them in front of hotels and motels and on the restroom doors of filling stations. I didn't like the signs. I felt as if I were in a foreign land. I couldn't understand why the signs were there, and I asked my father what the signs meant. He said they meant we couldn't drink from the water fountains. He said they meant we couldn't stop to sleep in the motels. He said they meant we couldn't stop to eat in the restaurants. I looked at the grand picnic basket I had been enjoying so much. Now I understood why my mother had packed it. Suddenly, the picnic did not seem so grand. Finally, we reached Memphis. We got there at a bad time. Traffic was heavy, and we got separated from the rest of the family. We tried to find them, but it was no use. We had to go on alone. We reached the Mississippi state line, and soon after we heard a police siren. A police car came up to behind us. My father slowed the Cadillac, then stopped. Two white policemen got out of their car. They eyeballed the Cadillac and told my father to get out. "Whose car is this, boy?" they asked. I saw anger in my father's eyes. "It's mine," he said. "You're a liar," said one of the policemen. "You stole this car." "Turn around and put your hands on top of that car and spread eagle," said the other policeman. My father did as he was told. They searched him, and I didn't understand why. I didn't understand either why they had called my father a liar and didn't believe that the Cadillac was his. I wanted to ask, but I remembered my father's warning not to say a word, and I obeyed that warning. The policeman told my father to get in the back of the police car. My father did. One policeman got back into the police car. The other policeman slid behind the wheel of our Cadillac. The police car started off. The Cadillac followed. Wilma and I looked at each other and at our mother. We didn't know what to think. We were scared. The Cadillac followed the police car into a small town and stopped in front of the police station. The policeman stepped out of our Cadillac and took the keys. The other policeman took my father into the police station. "Mother dear," Wilma and I cried, "what are they going to do to our daddy? They're going to hurt him?" "He'll be all right," said my mother. "He'll be all right." But she didn't sound so sure of that. She seemed worried. We waited. More than 3 hours we waited. Finally, my father came out of the police station. We had lots of questions to ask him. He said the police had given him a ticket for speeding and locked him up. But then the judge had come. My father had paid the ticket and they had let him go. He started the Cadillac and drove slowly out of the town, below the speed limit. The police car followed us. People standing on steps and sitting on porches and in front of stores stared at us as we passed. Finally, we were out of the town. The police car still followed. Dusk was falling. The night grew black, and finally the police car turned around and left us. We drove and drove, but my father was tired now, and my grandparents' farm was still far away. My father said he had to get some sleep, and since my mother didn't drive, he pulled into a grove of trees at the side of the road and stopped. "I'll keep watch," said my mother. "Wake me if you see anybody," said my father. "Just rest," said my mother. So my father slept, but that bothered me. I needed him awake. I was afraid of the dark and of the woods and of whatever lurked there. My father was the one who kept us safe, he and my uncles. But already the police had taken my father away from us once today, and my uncles were lost. "Go to sleep, baby," said my mother. "Go to sleep." but I was afraid to sleep until my father woke. I had to help my mother keep watch. I figured I had to help protect us too, in case the police came back and tried to take my father away again. There was a long, sharp knife in the picnic basket, and I took hold of it, clutching it tightly in my hand, ready to strike. I sat there in the back of the car, eyes wide, searching the blackness outside the Cadillac. Wilma, for a while, searched the night too. Then she fell asleep. I didn't want to sleep, but soon I found I couldn't help myself as an unwelcome drowsiness came over me. I had an uneasy sleep, and when I woke, it was dawn and my father was gently shaking me. I woke with a start and my hand went up, but the knife wasn't there. My mother had it. My father took my hand. "Why were you holding the knife, Lois?" he asked. I looked at him and at my mother. I was scared, I said. My father was thoughtful. "No need to be scared now, sugar," he said. "Daddy's here, and so is Mother dear." Then after a glance at my mother, he got out of the car, walked to the road, and looked down at one way and then the other. When he came back and started the motor, he turned the Cadillac north, not south. "What are you doing?" asked my mother. "Heading back to Memphis," said my father. "Cousin Halton's there. We'll leave the Cadillac and get his car. Driving this car any further south with you and the girls in the car, it's just not worth the risk." And so that's what we did. Instead of driving through Mississippi in golden splendor, we traveled its streets and roads and highways in Cousin Halton's solid, yet not so splendid, 4-year-old Chevy. Then we reached my grandparents' farm. When we reached my grandparents' farm, my uncles and aunts were already there. Everybody was glad to see us. They had been worried. They asked about the Cadillac. My father told them what had happened, and they nodded and said he had done the best thing. We stayed 1 week in Mississippi. During that week, I often saw my father looking deep in thought, walk off alone across the family land. I saw my mother watching him. One day I ran after my father, took his hand, and walked the land with him. I asked him all the questions that were on my mind. I asked him why the policemen had treated him the way they had, and why people didn't want us to eat in the restaurants or drink from the water fountains or sleep in the hotels. I told him I just didn't understand all that. My father looked at me and said that it all was a difficult thing to understand, and he didn't really understand it himself. He said it all had to do with the fact that black people had once been forced to be slaves. He said it had to do with our skins being colored. He said it had to do with the stupidity. He said it had to do with stupidity and ignorance. He said it had to do with the law that said we could be treated like this here in the South. And for that matter, he added, any other place in these United States where folks thought the same as so many folks did here in the South. But he also said, I'm hoping one day though, we can drive that long road down here and there won't be any signs. I'm hoping one day the police won't stop us just because of the color of our skins and we're riding in a gold Cadillac with northern plates. When the week ended, we said a sad goodbye to my grandparents and all the Mississippi family and headed in a caravan back toward Memphis. In Memphis, we returned Cousin Halton's car and got our Cadillac. Once we were home, my father put the Cadillac in the garage and didn't drive it. I didn't hear my mother say any more about the Cadillac. I didn't hear my father speak of it either. Some days passed, and then on a bright Saturday afternoon, while Wilma and I were playing in the backyard, I saw my father go into the garage. He opened the garage doors wide so the sunshine streamed in and began to shine the Cadillac. I saw my mother at the kitchen window staring out across the yard at my father. For a long time, she stood there watching my father shine his car. Then she came out and crossed the yard to the garage, and I heard her say, "Wilbert, you keep the car." He looked at her as if he had not heard. "You keep it," she repeated, and turned and walked back to the house. My father watched her until the back door had shut behind her. Then he went on shining the car and soon began to sing. About an hour later, he got into the car and drove away. That evening, when he came back, he was walking. The Cadillac was nowhere in sight. "Daddy, where's our new Cadillac?" I demanded to know. So did Wilma. He smiled and put his hand on my head. "Sold it," he said as my mother came into the room. "But how come?" I asked. "We poor now?" "No, sugar. We've got more money towards our new house now, and we're all together. I figure that makes us about the richest folks in the world." He smiled at my mother, and she smiled too, and came into his arms. After that, we drove around in an old 1930s Model A Ford that my father had. He said he'd factory order us another Mercury, this time with my mother's approval. Despite that, most folks on the block figured we had fallen on hard times after such a splashy showing of good times, and some folks even laughed at us as the Ford rattled around the city. I must admit that at first I was pretty much embarrassed to be riding around in that old Ford after the splendor of the Cadillac. But my father said to hold my head high. We and the family knew the truth. As fine as the Cadillac had been, he said it had pulled us apart for a while. Now, as ragged and noisy as that old Ford was, we all rode in it together, and we were a family again. So I held my head high. Still, though, I thought often of that Cadillac. We had had the Cadillac only a little more than a month, but I wouldn't soon forget its splendor or how I'd felt riding around inside it. I wouldn't soon forget either the ride we had taken south in it. I wouldn't soon forget the signs, the policemen, or my fear. I would remember that ride and the gold Cadillac all my life. The end. Thank you for listening, and make sure you check out tapechicago.org for more videos by teachers and teaching artists all across Chicago. Take care. Bye-bye.